afternoon. My name is Liza Hamilton, and I will be moderating the discussions today. I was chosen for this event because I serve on the board of the Center for the Study of Trauma and Radicalization with Parallel Networks, and I'm also the director of the Forum on Global Violence Prevention in the Health and Medicine Division at the National Academy of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. But on a more personal note, I was also chosen because I have the experience of being a third-generation Holocaust survivor. I am hoping some of my own experiences seeing this form of trauma and the effects of anti-Semitism in my own family may help me to better understand both the challenges and also the successes our speakers will describe today. It is my hope that through deep listening and reflection, we can progress the difficult conversations surrounding racial injustice, the effects of trauma, and our intervention frameworks for de-radicalization forward. And so I would like to introduce our speakers. First, we have Jesse Morton, who is a former jihadist extremist, who now leads de-radicalization intervention frameworks at Parallel Networks. We also have Mimi Olive, who is a community builder and is the granddaughter of Vernon Johns, the mentor to Martin Luther King Jr. After that, we have Daryl Davis, who is an activist and a truly inspired musician. We also have Hope Hyder, who is a life coach and writer. And finally, we have Tony McAleer, who is author of the book, The Cure for Hate, and the co-founder of the nonprofit Life After Hate, an organization that seeks to help people leave white supremacist movements behind. Each speaker will have 8 minutes to give us their insights. Then we will open the floor for a moderated discussion and we'll accept questions from the public. Jesse, would you like to begin?
Sure. Can I be seen video-wise?
Yes, you can.
Very good. Thank you. I just got a text that said I needed to put my webcam on. So thank you very much. Well, Lisa, thank you for moderating the discussion. My name is Jesse Morton, the executive officer at Parallel Networks. And today's webinar, which will be followed up by another on Thursday, discussing the future of the far right and reciprocal radicalization, is running coincident to the launch of our Control Alt Delete Hate e-zine, our online e-zine, which replicates a sort of propaganda framework that I established as a jihadist propagandist and recruiter back in the period of 2003 to 2011. And what we see going on right now is a world that is increasingly inundated with more and more activity on social media, more and more radicalization, and more ability to otherize and us versus them paradigm for how we view our current arena, where we're seeing a lot of feedback between different groups that are on the left, on the right, generational divides, and all of these divides and fractures, which are indicating a fragility and an uncertainty that will proceed going forward, that can only be countered, not by engaging, as we say at Parallel Networks, by attacking a problem at the same level of consciousness that created it, but having to have a higher order of consciousness. And one of the ways that I think jihadists, extremists on the far right, extremists on all levels of extremism are most successful is in their idea that if you absorb their message and their ideology, then you can, in a sense, transform yourself. But what many people that have been in extremist movements realize is that there is a feeling of meaning and significance that is almost an intoxicant that sort of takes one into a movement and offers this sense of the possibility and prospect for transformation. But once you stay in a movement long enough, you realize very seriously and early on, but there is a certain neglect to accept the notion that this notion of transformation is actually something that allows you to look outside of yourself for something that you can cling on to so that you don't have to look inside of yourself. And so the whole notion of, I think, today's discussion is really based around the fact that a lot of times we find the change that we do inwardly manifesting itself outwardly. And that is what the Control Alt Delete Hate paradigm that we promote, both in the magazine, but both as the mechanism that we use as a methodology for personal transformation, encapsulates. So what we argue under a trauma-informed approach to de-radicalization or to countering and combating polarization, hate, and extremism is a methodology that is outlined at the first stage in a control space, to control the space between stimulus and response, to pause and to live in the now, so that one can reclaim the self, make a commitment, an alt phase, an alternative phase, to a commitment to nonviolence, maybe even a recognition that the grievances of some extremist movements are legitimate, the way that they see them, unnuanced and as a justification for the commission of violence, is actually fraudulent and counterproductive to attaining any ability to address those grievances. And so we ask people, once we engage them, to alter their course and to begin a process of transformation in their life that allows them to enter into stage 3 type thinking, delete hate, which means that we need people to recognize that polarization, hate, and extremism and the fragility and uncertainty associated with them is something that we all have an obligation to pay attention to gain awareness of, and then to do something with our lives in whatever minimal capacity that might be to help address these situations. This is a byproduct of putting together at Parallel Networks collectives of survivors of extremism, former extremists, activists, advocates, researchers, and an eclectic mix of individuals, all with personal backgrounds that sort of document the power of transformation and the power of individual stories of transformation to resonate and to have some form of impact on the networks and the systems, the organizations, and the sort of collectives that we put ourselves involved in. And when you start to insert these voices inside of extremist networks to paint some nuance in between blacks and whites so that people can control that space between stimulus and response. And very briefly, I think that everyone's story here today will demarcate and outline a similar process, whether it's a former extremist, a survivor extremist, or the other speakers that we have with us, of how one, rather than looking at an outside world that seems to be cruel, unjust, or problematic, needing institutional and systemic change in today's climate, important to acknowledge and address, how looking inside of oneself as opposed to trying to impact the world outside of oneself is a much better mechanism and methodology for transforming and addressing those issues that surround us. My story as a jihadist is an awkward one because by all accounts I should have been an all-American boy. I'm a Caucasian, blue-eyed Caucasian from Pennsylvania, central Pennsylvania, who went on to become one of the primary radicalizers and recruiters and largely set the propaganda template upon which ISIS's recruitment was developed and formulated. And now, in a later stage, sort of replicated and adopted by the far right that we see today, and now in some senses also being utilized by a growing sense of general, we don't want to conflate all groups. So when we say the far left, we mean the violent extremist far left, those that are prone to commit violence in the name of advocating for a radical solution, tearing down society, tearing down capitalism, and et cetera, and how they intersect. I grew up and was formulated, and my personality was formulated in the context of, like many people that enter extremist movements, a developmental trauma that was a contextual circumstance that set off a personality inside of myself that made me ideal for role adoption as a propagandist and recruiter, seeking attention and recognition where there previously was none, due to a frustration that I felt as if society did not offer me an opportunity to heal the wounds that bore me, if you will. The poet Rumi said that the wound is the place where the light enters you. And I spent a large portion of my life stumbling around looking for something to belong to, so that I did not have to address the internal anxieties and turmoils that were going on inside of myself. And I give a brief background of how early developmental experiences can manifest themselves as extremism before we move on and cover that a bit in detail. I grew up in a situation where my mother, due to a number of factors, made bad and poor decisions in that space between stimulus and response, where she allowed the stimulus of anger and resentment, particularly in her relationship, and then coincided into her society, to allow her to beat her children. And I had two siblings, a younger brother and a younger sister. My mother very early on, due to frustration, started to beat me and my sister, but in typical psychological circumstance of an abuser, chose to protect my younger brother, as if it was a rationalization and justification. If I'm not beating one of my children, I must be justified in beating the other two. And Leo Tolstoy once said that every happy family is happy in the very same manner, but that every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way. But modern science shows us that that's actually not true, that there are patterns of dysfunction in dysfunctional families that manifest themselves as particular roles that people play inside of families. And one of those roles is a scapegoat, where the dysfunction in the family is blamed on one individual. That individual becomes the black sheep or the scapegoat of the child. And everyone subconsciously in the family collective is able to blame the scapegoat for the reasons that the family has dysfunction. But when we look at the real objective analysis of the situation, that's usually the most resilient person in the familial order with regard to being able to provide the coping mechanisms and then internally absorb the blows, and willingly, for the sake of preserving the family and some semblance of safety and sanity, willing to accept the role as the black sheep, and then going on to manifest other processes of psychology, such as self-fulfilling prophecies. My dynamic started, and the reason that I chose role as a propagandist and a recruiter was largely because, as the older sibling, I had to protect a very nimble and very a weaker younger sister who was constantly the ire of abuse, and who I would interject with and try to intercede with my mother's abuse against her. And the problem really was a dynamic of me seeing myself as standing up to tyranny and oppression. And it was the courage to stand up to the tyranny of my mother, and then coincident with, as life continued to develop, absorbing the scapegoat mentality and manifesting black sheep-like behavior in my society, and being stigmatized by my society as the problem, or as part of the problem, that allowed me to take and project what was going on in my family and project it onto society. So looking at my society outside of myself and resenting it because it didn't protect me from the abuser. When I was in ninth grade, I went to a guidance counselor and told him I was getting abused in the house. The guidance counselor called my mother in, but nothing was done about it. She came home, she apologized for the first time in her life for beating her children, and then very soon thereafter gave me and my sister the worst beating that we had ever received. But I persisted through that and ran away looking for a counterculture. And a lot of what we see in extremist movements or radical movements is a search for a counterculture. But what I realize in retrospect is that the adoption of this counterculture is largely a way to turn outward, as I was suggesting in the intro to this sort of discussion, to turn outward and to say, if society is cruel to me and I cannot trust it, why not allocate my energy in a direction that can tear down the society around me, in a sort of German nihilistic sense, where you're trying to destroy, you don't know what you want to build, but you do know that you want to build a society that is conducive to your own interests, that you reject the society, that you're willing to destroy it. But really it's a projection and a manifestation of the quest inside of yourself to destroy yourself, right? And so when
Jesse, we have time soon. Okay.
Yep, very good, very good. So when we look at reversing these processes, one thing that we're learning, and Liza said that she heads our operations at the center, helps to head our operations at the Center for the Study of Trauma and Radicalization, is how can we reverse engineer these processes and take that energy and reallocate it in ways that you'll hear alongside of stories like my own. I was able, after incarceration, to stop the impacts of trauma reverberating throughout my life, to pause between that space of stimulus and response, and to dig deep inside and to de-radicalize from an ideology that was outside of myself. But then, after 14 years of being intoxicated with a jihadist ideology, to relapse on drugs and alcohol for the first time in 14 years of my life, and to fall back into addiction temporarily, and then to come away with the conclusion that I hadn't actually changed. I had removed the extremist ideology outside of myself, which was my new intoxicant, and I returned to the intoxicants, drugs, and alcohol that served my purposes before extremism. Rebuilding from that relapse allowed me to understand a lot more about the power of transformative change and how it is much more an inward process than an external one. And I think that the narratives that follow my own will demarcate and delineate a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Jesse, that was fantastic. And I just love that you embraced the quote by Viktor Frankl, between stimulus and response, there's space. Mimi, you're up next.
Thanks, Liza. So when Jesse asked me to speak, as he's done before, I always say, I always want to get up and speak so that others realize the voice that they have in the world. So Jesse asked me to speak here today in regards to being the personal change that you want to see in the world. And that transformative change for me begins at my very roots. As you said earlier, Liza, my grandfather is Vernon Johns, and he is considered the father of the civil rights movement. He was a mentor to Martin Luther King Jr. and grew up in Farmville, Virginia. And my mother grew up with Martin Luther King Jr. at the table with many conversations. And my grandfather was a genius. He was a great orator. He was a Baptist preacher along the South and is renowned to this day in his circle. And he believed greatly in equality for Black Americans in this country, and had so many talks with Martin Luther King Jr. and his family and his pulpit and in his travels. He was a traveling minister, did a lot of the ground setting for the civil rights movement. And yet he died the year before I was born. And my mother, being his daughter grew up, she was one of 6 kids, and she grew up in the South with a father who was speaking out against the Jim Crow South. And so they grew up with the Ku Klux Klan burning crosses in the lawn and having to leave town and go set up somewhere else. And her father always would say, if you see a good fight, get in it. And that was very much the philosophy that we were raised in. And my mother married my father. They met at Spelman and Morehouse colleges. And my father became a dentist in the Navy. And I was born in Rhode Island. And when my parents talk about being transferred to Rhode Island, my father got there and the military didn't have any housing for a Black military officer. They only had housing for white officers. And they had to open subpar housing that had been closed down for them to live in because my father went around and could not find anyone that would rent to them in Rhode Island. And that was sort of the beginning of my family's personal work towards changing this country. We went to Japan after that. We were stationed in Japan, and I was a very young girl. And the world that I looked out on was nothing like me, and yet I was very at home in it. And the first person who really loved me outside of my family was my nanny, Hisako-san, a beautiful Japanese woman who just is so special to me to this day. And I left her behind when we came back to the United States, and my father was stationed in California. And once again, my mother had rented a house for us in the San Francisco Bay Area. And when my parents showed up and they realized that we were a Black family, they said no to renting. And so my parents had to put me and my 2 older sisters in Georgia with my godmother for the summer, while my parents hired a lawyer and fought to actually rent the house. And they won, and we moved in, and that was the beginning of my life in California. And I always knew from a very young age that you have to fight for what you want in the world. You need to stand up for what you believe you deserve. And that was something that was a legacy from my grandfather that was a very natural part of my life. And from there, in Walnut Creek, I lived in the California area until I was in my 30s. I went to public school, and I was out in farmland in an area that was all white, and people had never seen somebody who was Black. And people would always come up to me as a young child, and the kids would touch me and say, oh, I thought it would come off. I've never seen that before. And so being somebody who nobody had ever seen before was also something that was very natural to me. And I remember starting elementary school, and I had surgery on one eye, and I had to wear a patch over my good eye to strengthen the weak eye. So imagine this skinny little Black girl with a patch over her eye and glasses on. And I was nervous about going to school. And my mom said to me, Millicent, you know who you are. You love people, you're kind, you're outgoing. You go tell them who you are, you'll be fine. And I'll never forget, that was sort of the beginning for me of standing in front of that sea of white faces and saying hi and telling them about myself and realizing, well, this I can do. I can speak to who I am, and telling them who I am, and looking at a world that was a world of strangers and seeing just a group of people who were friends that I had yet to meet. And that was sort of the beginning of my personal life philosophy. And everywhere I have gone, I've always tried to be the person who reaches out and says, hi, this is who I am. I'd like to get to know you. Who are you? And that has carried me so far in my life. When I was in Oakland in my 20s, I gathered together a group of friends, and we started a nonprofit after-school performing arts program for children 5 to 15 years old, because at that time in the San Francisco Bay Area, the school systems had cut all the money for the programs in school for music and so forth. And so we put together an after-school program, and it was a nonprofit, and the children performed, they sang, they danced, and they put on plays to raise money. And then we would have the children decide which organization that they wanted to spend the money they'd raised on helping. And they donated to senior facilities, to Meals on Wheels. We would feed people at Thanksgiving. And this idea of the kids going out and using their own voices, raising money, and then helping their community was so empowering. And I think about those children today, they're now in their 30s and 40s, raising kids of their own. And I think of what that beginning of that sense of self-power, of taking your natural talent, of using your voice, and of giving yourself to the community. And I think always that has propelled me forward. How can I take my work on myself, my interest in the world around me, and put more good out into the world? And then I ended up here in DC at the National Academies, where I met Liza, and I met Jesse through Liza, and have really just continued focusing on speaking to people about doing the self-work, because the more you know and love yourself, the more you have to be available for someone else. And certainly I would say in my time, the more I know myself, the more I have to see other people, the more I have the opportunity to see how I can engage in the world around me. And many years ago, I was reading an article, and it was an article about Daryl Davis. And just recently, Jesse said to me, "Oh, I want you to come to my place, and there's a wonderful guy I want you to meet." And he started telling me a little bit, and I said, "Wait a minute, Daryl Davis, the musician?" And he said, "Yes." I said, "I've been wanting to meet him for years." And I think when you hear Daryl speak about his story, he will absolutely be able to show and attest to the fact that the more you know yourself, the more you love yourself, the more love you have to give to other people, you show them what they have within themselves to love. And that is what changes the world. And I will let Daryl take it away from there.
Thank you, Mimi. Thank you so much. Daryl, please speak.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mimi. Really appreciate that. And you know, your father definitely is the true father of the civil rights movement.
My grandfather, Vernon, yes.
Yeah, I'm sorry, your grandfather, Vernon, correct. I spoke to another man who was often jokingly, if you will, referred to as the father of the civil rights movement, and he did not like that term. His name, well, he's passed on now, his name was James Blake. Do you know who he is?
Yeah.
You know James? Yeah, okay.
Yeah,
Anybody else know who James Blake is? Well, let me just tell you real quick. James Blake is the man who drove the bus, who kicked Rosa Parks off the bus and called the police and got her arrested. He was a very racist bus driver down in Montgomery, Alabama. And when I spoke to him in the 1990s, before he passed away, he was still the same racist individual that he was in 1955 when he had Rosa Parks arrested, and he regretted nothing. Very, very hateful man. So people dubbed him the father of the civil rights movement, because that's pretty much when it started with that bus boycott, and that was a title that he really resented. But anyway, my journey began at the age, I guess, of 3, when I was born in 1958. So in 1961, I was 3 years old. My parents were in the U.S. Foreign Service. So I grew up as an American embassy brat, living all over the world. I lived in Africa, I lived in Europe, etc. So I was exposed to many different people and cultures from different lands, you know, all during my formative years. Today, as a professional musician, I play in some of these countries and also around the world. When you combine my travels as a child with my travels as an adult, I've been to 57 different countries on 6 continents. So all of that has helped shape who I've become. And as an adult, what I've realized is that no matter how far I've gone from my own country, how many different people or cultures I have seen, one thing I have concluded is this: we are all human beings, and we all basically want the same four things. We want to be loved, we want to be respected, we want to be heard, and we want the same things for our families as anybody else, no matter how far away, wants for their families. And if we understand these four things, when we communicate to people who are adversaries, regardless of the topic, whether it's race, whether it's some other topic upon which we feel one way and they feel another way, if we can accept that they also want these four things, it better enables that communication, because we spend too much time, especially in this country, talking about the other person, or talking at the other person, or talking past the other person. We should spend more time talking with the other person. And that's what I have found works for me. And I'm sure if people will apply that, it will work for them as well. And I can give you some extreme examples very quickly here. When I was 10 years old, just after coming back from overseas, you go to a country for 2 years, you come back home here, you're here for a few months, maybe a year, and then you're transferred to another country overseas. When I came back one time at the age of 10, I joined the Cub Scouts, and I was the only Black Scout in the area. And we had a parade in which I had rocks and bottles thrown at me. None of the other white Scouts were getting hit, but my troop leaders all came and huddled over me to protect me. It was only just a few people doing this, not everybody in the spectators. And I did not understand why it was being done. Later, my parents explained to me what racism was. Now understand, my background when I was overseas, I was around people from all over the world. Anybody who had an embassy in those countries, all of their kids went to the same school. So my classroom looked like a United Nations of little kids. And that was the norm to me in the 1960s. It was not the norm here in this country. When I would return home after my dad's assignment and go to school here in my own country, I would either be in all Black schools or Black and white schools, meaning the still segregated or the newly integrated. And there was not the amount of diversity in my classroom that I had overseas. So when this thing happened to me with the rocks and bottles, I could not wrap my head around it, because the people who were throwing these things at me did not look any different to me than my classmates or my little French friends or my little German friends overseas or what have you. So it couldn't have anything to do with the color of my skin. That's ridiculous. Why would anybody want to hurt me because of the color of my skin? My 10-year-old brain could not process that. And because of my prior exposure to people who look like that. Now, perhaps if that had been my first experience with white people, would I be doing this kind of work today? Maybe not. So that had set a precedent. And I formed a question in my mind at that time, which was, how can you hate me when you don't even know me? And for the next 52 years, I've been looking for the answer to that question. So, in school, we get academic education. Out on the street, we get empirical education. And it's important to have both, in my opinion. So I had the academic education. None of that could explain to me why I was undergoing what I've been through. So I decided to go to the source. I bought books on Black supremacy, white supremacy, the Nazis in Germany, the neo-Nazis over here, anti-Semitism, the Ku Klux Klan. All the books addressed the topic of racism and discrimination, but none of them told me why. So who better to ask than to go to someone who would go so far as to join an organization that has over 100-year history of practicing hating people who don't look like them and who do not believe as they believe. So I began seeking out members of the Ku Klux Klan. And I never dreamed I would become friends with any of these people, because as a child, we hear often, a tiger does not change its stripes, a leopard does not change its spots. So why would I think that a Klansman would change his robe and hood? But guess what? It happened. Not only did it happen one time, it happened multiple times. And I have the evidence to prove it. In interviewing these people, I treated them the way I wanted to be treated. And I applied those four things that I had learned inherently. Everybody wants to be loved, they want to be heard, they want to be respected, and they want the same thing for their families as I want for mine. And when I would ask these people, why do you hate me? All you see is black skin. Well, Mr. Davis, black people are prone to crime. That's why there are more criminals, more people in jail, in prison, than there are white people. Okay, he's right. But it's a half-truth. There are more blacks in prison than white people, but he's not considering the inequity of the judicial system or the fact that there are innocent black and white people in prison who could not afford adequate legal representation. So there they are, stuck in jail. So I'm just listening to him. And then he tells me that black people are inherently lazy. We don't want to work. We prefer to scam the government welfare system and get all the free handouts we can. Then I'm told that black people are born with a smaller brain than white people. So the larger the brain, the more space for intelligence. So that's why we always seem to score low on the high school SAT scores. Now, is what he is saying offensive? Absolutely, it is offensive. Am I offended by it? Absolutely not. And why am I not offended by it? Because what he is saying is an untruth. Why would I be offended by a lie? So this man just met me 5 or 10 minutes ago. All he sees is this, the color of my skin, and he's going to make these assertions about me. Why should I even be concerned? If my parents were to tell me, Daryl, you're lazy. Daryl, you're prone to crime. Daryl, you're not very smart, I might have some concerns because they brought me into this world, they raised me, but not somebody who just met me making these assertions. I'm not going to be offended by it. So I allow him to go ahead and get it all out, where this has never happened before with people like this. Usually when you say these things, there's pushback. No, you're the criminal. You're the one burning crosses in people's lawns. You're the one bombing churches and hanging people from trees and so forth and so on. There's that pushback, and then the whole conversation shuts down. I allow him to be heard. Allowing somebody to be heard is not kissing their behind. It's giving them the respect that you want in return. So essentially, I threw him off his game and his wall came down. That gives me the ability to plant a seed, because when you try to plant a seed when the wall is up, it's going to hit the wall and bounce right off. So now the wall's down. So when he's finished his diatribe on why black people are negative and bad, the wall is still down. Than attack him and what he said, I defend myself. I said, look, I don't have a criminal record. Nobody in my family has one.
Close to time.
Okay. I'm not on welfare, never been on welfare. I've never measured the size of my brain, but I'm sure it's the same size as anybody else's. So that allows him to hear what I'm saying. He does not hear what I'm saying when the wall is up. And as a result of him hearing what I'm saying, he thinks, when he gets home, I just had a 3-hour conversation with this black guy. And what he said makes sense, but he's black. But it's true, but he's black. So he's having this cognitive dissonance. And then he has to come to the conclusion, do I disregard the color of his skin and believe the truth and change my direction? Or do I continue living a lie? Fortunately, most of the ones that I've talked to changed their direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Daryl, for your inspiring talk. Hope has another extremely inspiring story. Hope, you're up.
Hi, everybody.
Yeah.
I'm just sitting here. Your stories are incredible, and I hope that Mimi and Daryl, you both have explored making films about some of the things that have happened in your life, especially the things that happened to you when you were children. It just came to life for me, and I think people today need to see those types of stories told so that we can illuminate the past and all the different dimensions in a new way. So I hope that both of you have considered that, because I can see it for sure. And I really thank you for sharing those stories. Very, very touching and inspiring.
Thank you
very much. Yes. I am here today because of my healing journey. This to me is evidence of the healing journey I'm on, because as a child, 6 years old, my father was murdered by a person, racially motivated, a hate crime, and really just spent many years of my life wrestling with not only the reality of death and the shock of that even occurring, because in my 6-year-old mind was not prepared for that at all, but also just what kind of world do we live in where any person would take another person's life. So most of my life from that point was spent wrestling with that idea, and just in my own mind, and just in the background. It was always there. And in my middle 20s, I was returning home from a trip in the Caribbean, and we were flying in and we saw the skyline. New York City was glistening and people on the plane were excited and the pilot was excited, and I wasn't excited. I was living a life I loved. I was coming from a trip that was wonderful. And I still had this sinking feeling inside of me that just for whatever reason in that moment became palpable for me. And I saw that dissonance that you were just talking about, that the present moment was offering me all this reason to smile and reason to rejoice, but there was something in me that wasn't feeling that way. And in that moment, that feeling just became the most pronounced thing in my life. So for weeks and weeks and weeks, I couldn't shake that feeling. Couldn't shake it, didn't know what it was, really didn't even know how to contextualize it. And really in a night of just being fed up, sat in a chair in my apartment and just said, universe, help me. I don't know what this is. And the voice came back to me and said, you never dealt with your father's death. And it was something that, of course, you know in yourself what you haven't dealt with, but you really don't know the role it's playing in your life, and at which point those unresolved issues in your life will come up to surface and really announce themselves as ready to be dealt with. So in that moment that I had that voice come to me in that realization, I just said, help me. And in that moment, so many different things started to unfold in the next few weeks. People coming out of my past to meet me, to help me. My grandmother coming to me in dreams, asking me who's handling the parole hearings. Me calling the United States Parole Commission. Me flying to Leavenworth to testify at the Parole Commission for the very first time with regards to my father's death. The A&E Networks doing a show about my father's murder, and me having a chance to speak about how I felt and what my family experienced. So all of these things start to rush in to help me. And that process opened me up to the realization that that force that was there for me, that rushed in, was there for everyone, because there was nothing special about me in terms of what I had been through or needing to be helped that qualified me for that type of assistance. So that healing process that started at that time, which was, conscious and deliberate, has taken me to this point today. And I feel like this opportunity would not have arisen were not for that time and that willingness to go on that healing journey and come to this place where I know now how much my healing is tied up and bound to the healing of all people. And that if you're a healed person, you can live in the world very differently. And there's a huge amount of service in just healing yourself in all the ways that you need to be healed so that you can really be there for other people. Because there's nothing like grief and trauma to help you develop empathy, to help you understand the people that you face day to day, the people that you run into in traffic, people at the grocery store, all have a history of trauma. Every single person has their own experience of it. And so my healing, my coming to this place where I completely trust in this force of life that provides nothing but solutions. Nothing but solutions. It's so solutions oriented. It's so inventive. It's so giving. It's so loving. And that love is for everyone to receive when you're open to it. And so a few years ago, I got the opportunity to speak with the person who killed my father. My brother was there also in a virtual parole hearing. I was not prepared to meet him. Well, I was prepared to meet him, but I didn't know I was going to meet him. Because again, my healing journey had prepared me. And my brother's healing journey had prepared him to be able to face this person virtually and see him and look him in his eye and tell him exactly how he had impacted our lives. And this man, who was 19 at the time, 6'5", in handcuffs and his orange jumpsuit, is looking at us and saying, I get it, you're right. I do belong where I am. I'm where I am because I chose to do something, and these are the consequences I'm living. And the people who had brought him up to that point, the pro officers and people who were supporting him, I spoke to them directly and said, listen, you have failed this person. If it's taken this many years, I'm in my early 40s. This person killed my father when he was 19. He's been in prison this long, and he has never faced any of the truth about what he actually did. And he's still working on that. He's still a person who's in extreme denial, but the satisfaction of being healed enough to be able to face him and speak to all the people in my family who he impacted, all the people in the city, all the people in the world who were touched by my father's story. When A&E did the episode they did about him, it reached the whole world. And so my satisfaction grows every single time I get to share my story, because for most of my life, I was really unsure whether I'd be able to find a way to live in the world that felt vibrant, where I could feel engaged. Because when you do go through that sort of trauma, for me, it was reconciling, why bother? What is it about being here that's so compelling that I can find the energy to, persevere and offer and be part of this when the type of thing that happened to my father can happen. And so over time, of course, I've come to a very different relationship with even death and what it means to me and what role it plays, in the life experience. But I have come to a place of, because the person who killed my father, I had a relationship with him my whole life. I knew his name, I had seen a picture, and then over the years, the research I did, told me the details of the case and all these grisly things, which were difficult, but were also helping me to orient myself, because I never saw his body. I didn't really understand really what actually happened. That was something I had to construct for myself over time. And so to be able to meet him, and my brother and I were both very surprised. We went out to eat afterwards, and we're sitting there eating thinking, I never expected to feel this level of compassion for this person. I didn't hate him, because I had gotten to the place where I've recognized as an individual, how do you get to that place where you leave a party with your friends and go out looking for people that hurt? Who are you? Who hurt you? How'd you get there? I'm very interested in the details, because for me, the details have always helped me to understand the truth of what's happening, instead of being able to say, oh, it's just racism, or it's just, that's not helpful to me. I like to understand what brought all the people in any situation together. Whether it's what happened to George Floyd, what happened to my dad, what happened to any of us. What is that moment made of, and how do we get there? That's always helped me orient myself, so that we felt compassion for him, that we both understood this is a moment in time that ended the way it did. And all those nuances, have affected the way that I'm able to operate in the world in terms of meeting a person where they are. And to reiterate something that Jesse touched on as well, which is, I don't believe that people actually are hating me if they don't know me. Daryl, you also spoke to this too. So they hate me because part of hating me is how they construct their identity. And so someone who has no identity wants one. I want an identity. I have to work on my identity too, and who I want to be in the world. So that urge to have an identity, that urge to belong, to be seen, to be heard, everyone has it. And I think that that's what's fueling extremist behavior in whatever direction it is. It's just wanting to have a sense of identity and wanting to matter, wanting to belong. And so when you
For time.
Yeah, we can see that you come to a new place of being able to relate to people. So that's how I got here, and that's how I hope to be of service and sharing. Thank you guys for listening.
Hope you never cease to amaze and astound me. Just the level of grace that you have. So
She's the reason that I'm here too. So you're another blessing sent to my life. I appreciate you and Jesse. And yeah, it's a tremendous opportunity. I'm very thankful to be here.
we're thankful to have you. Tony, you are up next.
Thank you. Thank you all for taking time out of your day to be here, and hope that required an incredible amount of courage. And when compassion is combined with courage, it's extremely powerful. And as I'm listening to these amazing stories, there's a couple themes that keep popping up, and one is compassion, and one is trauma. And so, how are those things connected? I grew up in a middle class, upper middle class family in Vancouver. My father was a psychiatrist. I went to private schools and all of that, and trauma. It's almost like everyone has some at some level. It's the human condition. It's what we have to overcome. And if we go back to Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, who we are in the face of these challenges defines us as human beings, and we can respond to it in different ways. I'm not really going to go into the story of my trauma, because it really doesn't matter. There's stuff there in the background. But what is it about trauma? What does trauma do? And I think beyond the physical and sexual abuse in trauma, I think it's the emotional mark that it leaves behind. And particularly for a young person, it leaves us with toxic shame, and it informs our subconscious self-identity belief system. And I came out of my childhood feeling unlovable, powerless, invisible, and all of these things. And these were lies I believed about myself. And I think we go out into the world and we live our reaction in reaction to those lies. And I think that's where, as Jesse talked about, people can get drawn into violent extremist groups because of this. I got a sense of power. I got a sense of I got attention when I felt invisible. I got acceptance when I felt unlovable, and I got power when I felt powerless. And those absolutely were intoxicating. And shame is a toxic shame. The difference between toxic shame and healthy shame is, healthy shame is I did bad, I did wrong. Toxic shame is I am bad, I am wrong, and it's running 24/7. And we spend an incredible amount of our lives doing two things with shame, toxic shame. One is we hide it from the world. We convince the world that it doesn't exist, and we pretend to be someone that we're not, and we put on armor and we put on masks, and all in order to feel safe. I mean, the reason we get into this trouble, we come into the world as these amazing. I think of who was little Tony when he came into the world. It was this bright, curious, mischievous, stubborn, defiant little guy, open to the world and sensitive. And then the world happens to us, and we learn it's not safe to be emotionally sensitive. It's not safe to be open, and we put all these sort of mechanisms in place in order to survive, in order to feel safe. But later on in life, we project our shame onto other people as one thing we do with it. And Dr. James Gilligan, who wrote a book called Violence, Reflections on a National Epidemic, who was a forensic psychiatrist at one of the prisons in California. And he wrote, all violence is an attempt to exchange shame for self-esteem. And I think that's very true. The other thing that we do, the insidious thing we do with shame is the dirty secret we hide from ourselves, and we internalize the shame. I think murder is the ultimate expression of externalized shame. Suicide is the ultimate expression of internalized shame, but it's substance abuse, eating disorders, all kinds of different avenues of self-harm because we're living up to the lie. You know, what's a word that is the opposite of shame? Pride. You know, and I took that feeling of less than, and I joined a social group and adopted an ideology which told me I was greater than. White pride worldwide, Proud Boys. That's this polarity that we live in with the shame that leads to so much dysfunction. And Jesse's absolutely right. We all have we all take on characters in a great family play, and you know, shame is intergenerational. It cascades from generation to generation, and I touch on it in my book when I talk about collective shame, group trauma that happens for different reasons, and how the dysfunction plays out through groups and large populations. So where does compassion come into this? If shame is the feeling of being less than and less than human, compassion is the antidote. When we treat someone with compassion, we basically hold a mirror up to them and allow them to see their humanity reflected back at them when they can't see it when they look into the mirror themselves. You know, my first experience with that was with my two children when I was in the depth of my time in the white supremacist movement. These kids didn't see the unlovable, weak, powerless monster that I saw. They saw this great, fantastic dad that was, you know, and I saw my humanity reflected back at me through their eyes, which was an incredibly powerful piece. And you know, the second piece to that compassion that's important is because compassion, I think, is incredibly misunderstood. It's an extremely powerful tool, but it's incredibly misunderstood. And when we combine compassion with healthy boundaries and consequences, then it can become a lot more powerful. It gives it structure and strength. And, you know, my mom, who never gave up on me, her love for me was unconditional, but her relationship with me was very conditional. And as a young man raising two children by myself, I required her help, and she leveraged that in order to move me away from the movement and to take care of these kids. I often say, you know, my two kids, I tell them all the time, you guys saved me. My third experience with compassion, and it's where my healing journey began, was with a Jewish counselor mentor, you know, Dov Baron, and of all people, he had compassion for me, and knowing that I'd been a Holocaust denier and a neo-Nazi and all of that stuff, that he could have that compassion, that he could see little Tony, the core essence of who I was. And he said that in our first session. He said, "That's what you did. It's not who you are. I see you. I see little Tony." And with that, I wept, and that began a journey of over 1,000 hours of one-on-one and group counseling that led to my transformation and healing and getting in touch with myself. And I think, Mimi, as you talked about, that journey within, the more I could discover who little Tony was, the more I lived my life in alignment and integrity with who little Tony was, the more my life improved, and the more I got into flow, the more I was able to understand my trauma, the more I was able to see and understand the trauma in others, particularly in groups that I had dehumanized. And what I realized sort of towards the end of that journey, the journey never ends, but you know, for 15 years of my life, I spent trying to change the world outside of me in order to find some sort of inner peace or inner soothing, to no avail. I just made my life worse. But what I've realized is the more I change the world with inside me, the more impact and influence I have on the world. And you know, I'm just going to finish up here on my practice of radical compassion. I'm just going to explain what that is. Radical compassion has three components. Number one, our practice of compassion has to take us outside our comfort zone. The problems of this world are not going to be solved within our comfort zone. Number two, our practice of compassion should incorporate a social activist component. It's not enough to ease the suffering of another human being, we need to change the environment which supports or creates the suffering in the first place. And the third piece to radical compassion is the most radical thing I think a human being can do, is to do that journey inward. And the more we can mine compassion within ourselves and developing self-compassion, the more we have capacity to give it to others. If we give compassion to others and not ourselves, that's about ego, that's not compassion. If we give compassion to ourselves and not others, that's narcissism. The two have to be in balance, and I'll finish with that.
All right, thank you all so much. This has been so interesting and inspiring. Gosh, we brought together an incredibly evolved group of people. Now, I was asked for some business items. First, we turned off video to preserve bandwidth, and the audience, the other people that are on, you can turn it back on when the questions begin. Also, you can raise the blue hand found in the participants component of the Zoom control panel if you want to ask the speakers some questions. I'm going to start this out with a few questions of my own for the speakers, and then we're going to open the discussion and the floor to everyone else. My first question is actually to Mimi. Mimi, your family history evinces a unique perspective and strength that has facilitated great change in the world. Essentially, that if you see a good fight, get into it. How can we as a community and as individuals integrate these messages during such an important time now and parlay them into action and intervention in a way that still incorporates wisdom and grace?
That's a heavy loaded question, Lisa. I would say that the biggest thing I got from my family, and I'll add also that my mother's cousin Barbara, who grew up down the street from her uncle Vernon, had trouble in her school. She was born in 1935. And in 1951, when she was 16, she came over to my mom's house and she was complaining to her uncle Vernon, because everyone went to Vernon with all their issues, about her school. She was living in Farmville, Virginia, in the segregated South. And the Black school that she went to had insufficient books. They had no coal to heat the stove. The school building itself was falling apart. And the white school across the way had all of the new textbooks and the brand new building. And typical of my grandfather, he said, Barbara, if you see a problem, it's your job to go fix it. And so cousin Barbara led a strike against R.R. Moton School that was part of the groundbreaking Brown versus the Board of Education that desegregated the school system in this country, in the South. And so I grew up just knowing cousin Barbara as a mother and a wife, and I grew up hearing about Vernon, yes, as this exalted, wonderful orator and intellectual person who led the congregation and mentored these big people, but I heard mostly about him as my mother's father and the personal stories. And so for me, life is for everyone what you make of it. And if you see something that you want changed, it's in your path for a reason. So you are part of the answer. And so I think that's what helped me the most. Being in a situation where I was the first Black person these people had seen, there's a common theme that everyone's speaking of, which is when you are given love, when you have compassion, when you have a sense of self-pride, you can understand those who don't. And you are in a situation where you can give to someone a view of themselves that is of love and compassion. And ignorance is nothing but ignorance. And so when there's a problem that needs fixing, I'm always here just to say, you yourself are the answer, because people feel powerless to be a part of the change in the world. People feel they have to be Gandhi, they have to be Vernon Johns, they have to be Martin Luther King Jr. But the more you are having love, forgiveness, compassion for yourself, the more inner work you're doing, the more you see that what you have to give is honed for your very life to do the work you need to do. And really, my family is what showed me that. They were just ordinary people living their lives, seeing a wrong and being the person to right it without any particular skills or tools, just the desire to make something better for themselves and for the world around them. And so I'm always here to say to anyone, if I can be here, you can be here. If I can love myself, you can love yourself. And when you love yourself, and when you're here, and when you see that there's work to be done out in the world, you will also see the way to be part of the change.
That was beautiful, Mimi. Hope, I have a question for you. Hope, you once helped me to understand how you were able to understand your father's murderer enough to heal from what he did. And through this, I was able to apply this lesson to my own family trauma. Can you please share this important perspective? That's your first part of the question. And the second is, how can people support survivors of racial and anti-Semitic violence better?
Okay. Reiterate your first point to me so that I know exactly what I'm answering.
Okay. I said, Hope, you once helped me to understand how you were able to understand your father's murderer, his perspective,
Okay,
enough to heal from what he did. And through this, I was able to apply this lesson to my own family trauma. Can you please share this important perspective?
Yes.
Second part of this is, how can people support survivors of racial and anti-Semitic violence better?
Thank you for that question. I will answer it by saying, my father is buried at a cemetery that's near the house where I grew up. And it's a place where I found a lot of solace. I like cemeteries, they're very quiet. And when I walk around, I always can reflect on, I'm above ground, these people aren't, and let me make the most of this. So I was there one day and just near my father's grave, and I pray, meditate, just speak to him whenever I want. But at that time I was speaking to him there. And his voice came to me and said, don't let what happened to me be an excuse for you not to be happy. Can you find a way to be happy? And so I never really think about necessarily trying to be happy as a goal. And so even at that time, it was kind of a radical proposition for me, because I wasn't ever necessarily thinking that way, because I was focused on more of just the healing and getting to a place where I had a real sense of belonging and sense of zeal for life in the way that I knew it was possible. But that challenge, I think, helped me to reimagine how I could utilize that relationship that I had with this person that killed him. Because again, when something comes into your life, it's coming to your life. You know, how you're going to greet it and how you're going to relate to it is what it's about. I can relate to this person any way I want to. If I relate to him with hatred, if I relate to him with just pointing the finger at this person who did this horrible thing and now my life can't be any good, I lose. It was my determination to not let anything be an excuse for me not to find a way to be happy. Even if I spent my life pursuing the pursuit of finding a way to be happy and never finding it. Even if I didn't find it, the pursuit of finding it became my mission, in terms of saying, I can't let this be an excuse. I can't let anything be an excuse to that, because my gift of life is my gift of life. It's been given to me. And if I can find a way to love my life, and this has occurred, then I feel I can face anything. And that's what really, I think, inspired me, that perspective of saying, you're going to let this be the thing that keeps you from enjoying this gift? No, can't do it. I refuse to do that. So I think that that's one way in which I encountered that perspective and that resilience to encounter that. In terms of how people can support people who have experienced violence that's racially motivated, or like you said, people who are experiencing any type of discrimination based on their religious preferences or ethnicity, I think the best way to support really is listening, caring, and listening leads to caring, that deep listening that someone alluded to earlier. That's really about being there, receiving someone with no quarreling going on in your mind, not even conceptualizing of what they're saying, just listening and receiving where they're coming from. and being that witness so that people can be seen and can be heard, which is such a fundamental need of all people who are born. Everyone needs that, and everyone suffers from a deficiency in that area. I've never met anyone who didn't encounter some sort of not getting quite enough of being seen and heard. So everyone needs that, and it's anybody, but especially people who know that they've been through trauma, who can talk about the trauma, and then model for other people how vocalizing it and moving that energy out of yourself where it's been stored can start that process of alchemy so that you can actually begin to heal. And then other people, like you alluded to earlier, Mimi, can in themselves say, well, that person spoke up and they seem to be relieved. Now they have a smile on their face. I can see that they're lighter. Maybe if I share, I can feel that too. And so I think that modeling for people and holding that space where you show other people the way is one of the best ways that people can do it for free. And then of course, giving money, supporting, there's so many other ways, but just listening, hearing, being a witness and insisting upon that, insisting on being one who will be the witness. I think it's important for sure.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Tony, this is a question for you. I've read that you went into a long journey of recovery with a lot of therapy, and that this helped you to reconcile what drove you to the white supremacist movement. What do you believe helped you the most in recognizing that that path wasn't for you?
Oh, that's a deep question. In the journey of self-discovery and learning the true nature of who I am, the true nature of who we are, and when you get down below the surface of the skin, at a spiritual level, at an energetic level, at some of these deeper levels, all of it melts away. And the way I've described it is, I can think of the world of the earth as flat, and then I can go and have an experience in a rocket ship and look down and actually get a whole additional set of information that informs me that it is in fact round. And that's how I view the views that I had before. I didn't have this deeper understanding of the nature of our existence, our spiritual selves, our energetic selves, and that at underneath we're all the same. And I did in my exploration of different tantric practices, where you are blindfolded and you have to feel into the energy of the other person. At that deeper level, there is no gender, there is no race. And so understanding that there's much more to this world than what's on the surface, and that part of my deep, inward journey, that sort of really helped me. I believe we're spiritual beings having a human experience. And I'm wearing a meat suit, for lack of a better term, and it just seems utterly ridiculous to me now to get all hung up on the meat suit when there's a whole other world to explore, which unites and connects us all, and the understanding that everything is interconnected. We are interconnected as human beings, and it's only the ego mind that separates us. That's the woo-woo journey that I took.
That is fantastic. Thank you so much. And Daryl, I have a question for you. So Daryl, you've had unique experiences with white supremacists. If you could offer only one piece of advice to others who are attempting a similar form of intervention framework, what would it be? And how do we encourage people to forge more compassion for those that are marginalized and subjugated, as you've been able to do, to parlay your own experiences and get people that we, typically don't believe would be able to forge this compassion to have this compassion?
Well, first of all, I would suggest that whatever the topic is that you're entering into with an adversary, whether it's race, abortion, global warming, the current presidency, the war in the Middle East, whatever the hot topic of the day is, learn as much as you can about your adversary or opponent's position and their ideology. Try to understand where they're coming from. So that way you have two sides of the coin, because then there's always that third side, that edge, that leaves room for strengthening. So learn as much as you can about the other person's ideology and their position. And then also know who you are. Know exactly who you are. Have your self-esteem in check, because you may hear some things that you don't like that are going to be said about you. Especially, in my case, if I'm dealing with white supremacists, obviously they're white supremacists for a reason. They don't like me, or people like me, or some other groups, people like you, etc. So be prepared for that. Don't let your emotions get in the way. Be prepared to listen. Listening is very, very important. If you want to be heard, you have to be willing to listen. And again, I cannot stress to you to know who you are. And if you do know who you are, then you don't have any fear going in there and hearing things about you that may or may not be true, because you know who you are. If you don't know who you are, you have no business meeting with these people, because they will tell you who you are. And depending upon your level of self-esteem, you might leave there believing them. So know who you are, and go from there, but be willing to listen. If you want somebody to listen to you, don't shut them down. Give them their space, allow them to express their views, regardless of how offensive they may be. And then when you respond, do not respond offensively. Simply defend your position and ask more questions. And that will allow you to come back again and have another conversation. Because when you're doing that, you are essentially planting a seed. Because now, when you are actively learning about somebody else, at the same time, you are passively teaching them about yourself. So they're learning about you. And the idea is for you to come back again and again and have more conversations with these people. And every time you come back, you're going to water that seed. They don't realize it, but that seed is beginning to grow because they're understanding you. And your credibility is the most important thing that you have. Always be transparent, always be honest, because you only have one opportunity to make a good first impression. You may have a second or third opportunity if you're lucky, but you only have one to make a good first impression. And people generally judge you on their first impression of you. So even though they may not have liked me, they found me to be credible, and that allowed them to say, okay, I'll meet with you again next week. When I would say, hey, can we get together again in 2 weeks or whatever? They would say, yeah, even though they don't like me, because of my credibility, all right? If I did not make a good impression the first time, they would not want to meet with me again. So that's important.
Thank you so much, Daryl, for your wisdom. Jesse, we have a question from the public. This is from Faris El Nazir, and Faris had asked, could Mr. Morton tell us, or if you'd like to speak as well, Faris, we can bring you on, I believe.
Yes, thank you. How are you?
Go ahead. Good, how are you? Would you like to give your question?
Yeah, if I may. Jesse, phenomenal work. I have to tell you, I am so inspired by what you've done. I don't want to get into a lot of details about my background. Maybe you can look me up on LinkedIn later, but I've spent a lot of time in the Middle East, and my family's of Jordanian descent. And I've watched as the Middle East has largely just been gripped by this issue of extremism, and they're just people are just stunned. They're almost in shock silence almost as to what's happening in their communities. So what I wanted to ask you to get right to the point, and forgive me, I lack your eloquence, Jesse. I was really inspired what you had to say. And by the way, we're connected through, I learned about this event through Dr. Alex Nesich, who's, I know Jesse spent a lot of time working with her. And Alex spoke to me about some of her work with you, Jesse. And what I was so stunned by is, and I'm former military as well, so I spent a lot of time in the region, and we get so fixated on the socio-political, economic aspects of violent extremism. And it's so rare that we actually look at the psychological aspects. And I've had a chance to learn a little bit about your own journey. And what I'm asking, so I'm a father, I'm a husband, I'm a coach, I'm a member of this community. And what I'm seeing is, I know you've taken responsibility for what happened, but I think we can all collectively say your community, that guidance counselor and others, I don't want to fixate on that alone, they also let you down. So what went wrong there? What should people like me be doing to make sure that these people, children usually, that are facing trauma, that are not being overlooked? Because if, I think what we've learned in the last 20 years, 9/11 on, is if one child in the world is suffering, I don't want to get too, tree huggy here, but if one child in the world is suffering, we're all suffering, and we all have the chance. There may be a chance where we'll pay for that child's suffering. So anyhow, enough for me. I'd love to hear your thoughts and expound on this, if you may, Jesse. Thank you.
Well, thank you for joining us, first and foremost, and to all that have participated. I think the objective of these conversations, in a very simplistic, but not so simplistic, in a very holistic sense, is to understand that a lot of what we've done as a society, particularly post 9/11, has not paid attention to what we're learning in other realms of thinking, which allow us to be multidimensional, multisectoral, and look at a trauma-informed care approach. So our organization is built on a trauma and violent and countering violent extremism informed approach. So we blend the best from CVE, but recognize that countering violent extremism has largely made the problem worse, even where they think it's successful, because they don't understand second and third order effects, and they don't understand to communicate with in the realm of a trauma-informed perspective. So a trauma-informed perspective requires you to get in, as Daryl said, to the worldview and to the ideology and the narratives that extremists tell about themselves, with a nuanced understanding that is non-judgmental, not to agree with the perspective of the extremist, but to understand the importance of an empathetic approach to formulating programming around such. And I would argue that the reaction that we had to 9/11 was everything that was in line with extremists, and that is very similar to the reaction that we have subconsciously with what goes on in our classrooms as well, and with regard to racism and everything. There's this implicit sort of reactionary approach that we take when we're confronted with stimulus and response. And when we operate in a fight, flight, or freeze space, as Alexandra goes into in great detail, we operate in the amygdala and the emotional realm of our thinking. We don't operate in the prefrontal cortex. Yet when we talk about counter-narrative and PSYOP work and things like this, we're communicating rationally with the prefrontal cortex when extremists are processing information in the very emotional sort of reptilian level of the brain. And that's true with regard to all of the programming, when it's prevention and whatnot. And so because of the demand for empiricism and evidence-based driving of practices, we're always having a delay in the programming and approach that we take. It's very similar to the way that we structure our educational system. So a lot of the social sciences, because of the demand for evidence-based practices, have relied on things like cognitive behavioral therapy, because you can measure it, you can show an impact. But what we're developing in the realm of trauma treatment is an ability to measure impacts in other ways, Fitbits to measure, structural fluctuations in stress tests, follicles in the hair that can show fluctuations in cortisol and things of this nature. We know all of this to the point where we have a paradigm that we can call a trauma-conscious society that we should be advocating for. And we might say that the Middle East was traumatized by a series of reactionary politics and movements precedent to the rise of Salafism transitioning into Salafi jihadism in a way that was a collective trauma, right? That processed things in the way that extremists process things by going back to a pristine past, promoting a utopic future, and thereby never having to concentrate on the pragmatism of the then and now, and collectively processing all of information in the amygdala. And in response to 9/11, we built an entire society based upon not building our own bridges, building our own educational institutions as the proper reaction to why do they hate us, but instead going abroad and trying to fix things outside of ourselves, because that stimulus and response that Osama bin Laden gave us was largely in fight, flight, or freeze, and we stayed in that space. And so a lot of what's done due to the demand of over-scientizing everything is really problematic, because we know none of it really works when you measure it in a holistic sense with second and third order effects. So when we start to think through these lenses, then everything we do, from how we address systemic racism to how we build out our educational institutions to make people resilient from extremism, no matter where we find ourselves in the world, we need to stay up to date. And there's a delay because we're very reductionist in the thinking that we have in the counterterrorism. And that's why the work that Alexandra and others, like it, is so groundbreaking. It's why we actually founded the Center for the Study of Trauma and Radicalization, in order to explore these questions and the intersectionality of it all. So we can continue the discussion. I'd be honored. Maybe Alexandra can put us in touch, and we can all have a chat and talk more specifically about that. That's the general framework that we're trying to build out an approach. And we get criticized all the time because we actually talk to neo-Nazis. We actually talk to jihadists, and then they say they should just be silent and go disappear. But de-radicalization, just like radicalization, is as much an individual process as it is a group one and a collective one. And so all these people that are interventionists and I can access in my organization are people that have supported me greatly in my own process of healing. And so we're building networks around individuals. So we also have to think in terms of networks, and that's the final piece. But we should continue the discussion. Hope I didn't go on for too long. Thank you very much.
No, I look forward to it, brother, and thanks for what you're doing. And I'm just a lot going on in my brain right now. Thank you.
Thank you both so much. Now we're short on time, so if we can try to make this quick, we have 2 hands raised. The first is Amanda Wallace, and the second is Dr. Alex Nezik. Amanda, would you like to provide your question first?
Thank you so much. I should probably put it in the context of I'm here from Melbourne, Australia. And so I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm speaking to you from, which is the Wurundjeri, belongs to the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. Aboriginal people or First Nations people have been here in Australia for over 60,000 years, maybe up to 120,000. We don't really know yet. The oldest living continuous culture in the world. I was born in 1972, and I should add that those lands were never ceded. And so that remains in dispute. I'm living in a current British colony because the Queen of England is still our Queen. Unlike you guys as a republic there in America. And also we had a White Australia policy that was only officially ended in 1973, and I was born in 1972. So I work now at a place called the Safer Families Centre for Research Excellence, which is based at the University of Melbourne, and it's a collaborative research centre which looks at violence as a health issue, and specifically family violence, and how family health systems can better address family violence. So everything that everyone has said, I'm so grateful to be listening to this conversation. You're all amazing, the work you're doing. I'm absolutely in awe. And I have lived experience of family violence, which is why I'm doing the work I'm doing now as a survivor advocate. So everything that you're saying is just I can feel my heart and my mind expanding throughout this conversation. And the original question had for you is how do you maintain positivity with everything that's going on in America at the moment? But I think my question has changed now to, I was a teacher librarian and also a special education needs teacher for 7 years. And at the time, I didn't realize the depth of my own trauma and how that, so I was basically the wounded healer. And I guess the conversation that you guys have just had about what teachers could do, I think one of the best things that we could do for teachers and other people that work with young people is a lot more, as you say, trauma-informed training, because really when you're doing that, I don't like the term frontline in the sense that it has that sort of war metaphor about it, but you are at the very front of society. Kids are the kind of the distillation of everything that's wrong, whether it's poverty and violence and drug addiction and food abuse, everything. So this is probably more a comment than a question, because everything you all said is just, and I'm so privileged again and honoured to be in this conversation. has sort of answered so many of the questions that I've had. So that wasn't really even a question. Sorry, I just wanted to, I just wanted to say an opportunity to say thank you, really, I guess.
Amanda, you're amazing.
Amanda, we're really happy that this group has inspired you, and thank you so much. We're glad that we touched your heart, and you definitely reflect that kindness and that openness as well. Thank you for that. Dr. Alex Nizik, you're up.
Thanks so much. Can you do my video? Start my video. Oh, I can start my video. Okay. My video disappeared and I wasn't the culprit, so I had to text Jesse. I'm like, can I get my video back? Oh, thank you so much. I know that we don't have time, and I'd love to have a much larger conversation, obviously, since I've had the pleasure of working with Jesse on a lot of the trauma pieces, and I would love to know more about. I really appreciated the stories shared. Tony, I've heard you speak at several conferences years and years ago, and your story's always been so powerful. So I won't ask my question because we don't have time to get into it. I just hope that maybe we do another follow-up now that this seems like a really good venue and a platform. Maybe, Jesse, we can talk about doing one that specifically talks about trauma and terrorism, which is what Faris El Nasser, who spoke earlier, I'm so glad that you're here, sir. He runs these virtual Madafa sessions every other Saturday, and he brings in really awesome speakers. People from all over the world join, especially his Iraqi colleagues. And maybe because this is such an important issue and oftentimes overlooked, and I'm talking specifically about trauma, then that, you know, overcoming trauma and leading into reconciliation and healing and transformative lived experiences, that we can't, I think we have a very good opportunity to continue this discussion. So I just want to throw that your way. As something to think about. And I know you have another event coming up on Thursday, Jesse, but as this group with Lisa, great job moderating all of this. I would really love to have another follow-up and to specifically talk about trauma, because there's so many important points that all of you mentioned. Tony, your shame to toxic shame and all the psychological components that I think wider audience should learn about, because we are dealing with a collective trauma all over the world, and people are not even self-aware that they're going through it. So that's my 2 cents. I really, really appreciate this. Thank you, everyone.
And I'm just going to cut in here before Lisa shuts off. And thank you so much, Alexandra, and especially for inviting Faris and everyone that joined us. You see many friends in the room. We are going to have to build out a more detailed, continued set of webinars, podcasts, and other activity to explore this realm at the Center for the Study of Trauma and Radicalization, where we can start to have these conversations. Each speaker on this panel, I think, is worthy of a session in and of themselves, and giving an opportunity of people to pick their brains and explore this. And of course, we'll continue our work. So just wanted to say that this is the beginning of something that we'll try to put together on a regular basis that focuses particularly on the trauma piece and then the control, alt, delete, hate paradigm that we utilize. So thank you guys all for coming. You're such wonderful people. I'm honored to have you in my life, and I know that you all feel the same way about each other. Beautiful.
Indeed. Thank you, Jesse.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks,
We are
Jesse.
honored to have you as well. Thank you all so much. We are so honored to have these speakers and this audience that is so interactive and interested in what is happening here. You all have such open minds and such open hearts, and that's really what all of this is about. And let's, please feel free to write us. Jesse, if you have any advice on how to get in touch, if they're not in touch with us, that would be great right about now.
We can be contacted at ParallelNetworks at pnetworks.org. And if you want to reach out to any of the speakers on the list, we will personally put you in touch with them. And we'd be honored to continue the conversation in whatever capacity possible. Thank you so much, Lisa, for moderating.
Absolutely. Have a wonderful day, everyone. Thank you.
Take care, guys. Have a beautiful day.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you, everyone. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.